March 4, 1944, Berlin, Germany. Luftwaffe fighter pilots scrambled from Tempelhof airfield to intercept incoming American bomber formations. Intelligence had warned that a larger raid was approaching the capital. Pilots ran to their aircraft, climbed into cockpits, and took off to meet the threat. This was routine by 1944 standards. American bombers had been conducting daylight raids over Germany for months. German pilots knew the pattern. American B-17 and B-24 bombers would approach in massive formations accompanied by fighter escorts that would turn back when they reached their fuel limits. Then, German fighters would attack the unprotected bombers. The escorts, usually P-47 Thunderbolts or P-38 Lightnings, had limited range. They could protect bombers to the German border, sometimes slightly beyond, but they couldn't reach deep into Germany. Once the escorts turned back, German fighters had freedom to attack bomber formations without interference. Berlin was far enough inland that bomber formations attacking the capital never had fighter escort. The distance was simply too great. American fighters couldn't fly 500-plus miles from their bases in England, engage in combat, and have enough fuel to return. Thematics of fuel capacity and combat radius made it impossible. So when German pilots climbed to altitude and spotted the incoming bomber formation, they expected to find what they always found over Berlin: hundreds of unescorted bombers that could be attacked without having to fight through fighter screens. Instead, they found American P-51 Mustangs flying escorts at 25,000 ft. Oberlieutenant Heinz Noah, flying his Bf-1009 G6, later wrote about that moment. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. American fighters over Berlin. It was impossible. We knew their combat radius. We knew they didn't have the range. Yet there they were, silver P-51s flying circles around the bomber formations as if they had unlimited fuel. The German pilots' confusion was understandable. They'd calculated American fighter ranges carefully. They knew the P-47 Thunderbolt had a combat radius of approximately 375 meters with drop tanks. The P-38 Lightning could reach about 450 meters. Neither could reach Berlin from bases in England. The distance was over 600 meters one way. The P-51 Mustang, however, could fly combat missions covering over 1,300 meters total distance. With external drop tanks, the P-51 could escort bombers from England to Berlin, engage in combat, and return home with fuel to spare. The Merlin engine, the British Rolls-Royce engine that replaced the original Allison engine in P-51 designs, was extraordinarily fuel-efficient. Combined with the P-51's sleek airframe and carefully designed fuel systems, the aircraft achieved range that no other fighter matched. But German intelligence hadn't believed this was possible. Reports about P-51 range capabilities had been dismissed as American propaganda. German aeronautical engineers had calculated that achieving such range would require compromises. Reduced armament. Minimal armor or performance limitations, the A. Reports suggesting that the P-51 had long range, and good performance and adequate armament were rejected as impossible. Now German pilots were encountering those impossible aircraft over Berlin. The tactical implications were catastrophic for Germany. The entire German air defense strategy was built around the assumption that American bomber formations would be unescorted over German targets. German fighters could attack at will once escorts turned back. German pilots could position carefully, coordinate attacks, and press engagements without worrying about enemy fighters. That strategy was now obsolete. If American fighters could reach Berlin, they could reach anywhere in Germany. There would be no safe distance where bombers flew unescorted. Every target in Germany was now vulnerable to escorted bomber raids. The initial engagement over Berlin on March 4, 1944, demonstrated the problem immediately. German fighters attempting to attack the bomber formation had to fight through P-51 escorts first. The P-51s were fast, over 440 mph at altitude, matching or exceeding German fighter speeds. They were maneuverable, not as tight-turning as Bf-109s at low speed, but competitive at high speed, where most combat occurred, and they were well armed. 6.5 caliber machine guns provided heavy firepower. More importantly, the American pilots had fuel reserves for extended combat. German fighters engaging the escorts couldn't force the Americans to break off by threatening their fuel status. The P-51s could fight over Berlin for extended periods and still have enough fuel to escort bombers home. German pilots who'd grown accustomed to attacking undefended bombers now faced a brutal choice: fight through P-51 escorts and accept heavy losses, or allow the bombers to reach their targets unmolested. Either option led to German defeat, one through pilot attrition, the other through destroyed industry. Luftwaffe command initially hoped the March 4th mission was an anomaly. Perhaps the P-51s had used a forward staging base, or had been fitted with on-way fuel configurations, or had benefited from unusual weather conditions. These hopes collapsed when P-51 escorts appeared over Berlin, again on March 6th and again on March 8th, and again throughout March and April. The Americans weren't conducting special on-time missions. They were running regular escorted raids to Berlin. The P-51's range wasn't a theoretical capability or a propaganda claim. It was operational reality that was destroying German air defense strategy. German fighter pilot casualties increased dramatically. Before P-51 escorts reached Berlin, German pilots had operated with significant advantages over unescorted bombers. Now they face well-trained American fighter pilots in aircraft that matched or exceeded German performance. The psychological impact was severe. German pilots who'd once had confidence in their ability to defend German airspace now face opponents they couldn't reliably defeat. Adolf Galland, inspector of fighters for the Luftwaffe, later wrote, "The day I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the was up. We'd lost air superiority. Our strategy of waiting for escorts to turn back before attacking bombers was finished. The Americans could now protect their bombers anywhere in Germany, and there was nothing we could do about it." The appearance of P-51s over Berlin forced German air defense to completely reorganize. The strategy that had worked for months, waiting for escorts to turn back, was obsolete. New tactics had to be developed immediately, but no good options existed. German commanders tried massing fighters in overwhelming numbers, hoping to break through P-51 escorts through sheer numerical superiority. This resulted in massive air battles where German losses were catastrophic. The 8th Air Force mission to Berlin on March 6, 1944, resulted in 69 German fighters shot down against 11 American fighters lost. The kill ratio favored America by more than 2-1. The mathematics were brutal. Germany couldn't replace experienced pilots at the rate they were being lost. Pilot training programs required months to produce competent pilots and years to produce veterans. American pilot training programs were producing thousands of pilots annually, with hundreds of flight hours before they ever saw combat. German training programs constrained by fuel shortages and compressed timelines were producing pilots with minimal preparation. By spring 1944, the average German fighter pilot had significantly less training than the average American pilot. German replacements sometimes had under 100 hours of total flight time, barely enough to operate the aircraft safely, much less engage in combat against experienced opponents. These inexperienced pilots were thrown against veteran American squadrons flying superior aircraft, and the results were predictable. Major Georg Peter Ader, a Luftwaffe ace who survived the war, described the situation. "By mid-1944, we were sending boys into combat against men. Our replacements didn't have the training or experience to survive. They'd last one mission, maybe two. Then they were gone. We couldn't maintain pilot quality when we were losing experienced men faster than we could train replacements." The P-51's impact extended beyond direct combat. German fighters that had previously been stationed near potential targets now had to be positioned to intercept bomber formations earlier and farther west, hoping to engage before bombers reached their targets. This meant German fighters were burning fuel reaching interception points, then fighting P-51 escorts, then potentially pursuing bombers, all while the Americans had fuel reserves from their superior range. German pilots increasingly found themselves running low on fuel in engagements. They'd have to break off combat not because they were losing, but because continuing would mean running out of fuel before reaching base. American pilots with P-51's fuel reserves could press engagements, knowing they had margins that German fighters lacked. The strategic bombing campaign, that had been costly and uncertain in 1943, became devastatingly effective in 1944. Once P-51 escorts could reach any target in Germany, American bomber losses dropped dramatically. Missions that previously experienced 5 to 10% losses now saw losses under 2%. The protection P-51 escorts provided meant bomber formations could maintain formation discipline, complete bombing runs accurately, and return home with acceptable casualties. German industrial capacity, which the bombing campaign aimed to destroy, began crumbling under sustained attacks. Oil refineries were bombed repeatedly. Fuel production dropped catastrophically, and the fuel shortages further constrained German pilot training and combat operations. Aircraft factories were bombed, reducing production of replacement aircraft. Ball bearing factories were hit, disrupting manufacturing across German industry. The P-51's range made all of this possible. Without escorts, American bombers couldn't sustain the losses required to maintain campaign intensity. With P-51 escorts, the bombing campaign became a sustainable operation that systematically destroyed German war production. By summer 1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively defeated as an organized force capable of defending German airspace. German fighters still flew, German pilots still fought, but they did so without realistic hope of stopping American bomber formations. The appearance of P-51s over Berlin in March had marked the beginning of the end for German air defense. Luftwaffe pilot losses in 1944 exceeded 13,000 killed, more than all previous years of the war combined. Experienced pilots who'd survived years of combat were systematically eliminated. The veteran corps that made the Luftwaffe formidable in 1940 to 1942 was gone by late 1944, replaced by inadequately trained replacements who stood little chance against experienced American pilots in superior aircraft. German high command recognized that air superiority was lost. Intelligence reports documented the P-51's capabilities accurately. The range was real. The performance was genuine, and there was no German counter. The Mi-262 jet fighter could outrun P-51s, but it was produced in limited numbers, required extensive maintenance, and operated from bases that were themselves targeted by bombers escorted by P-51s. The psychological impact on German defenders extended beyond pilots to civilians and ground forces. Seeing endless formations of American bombers passing overhead, escorted by fighters that circled protectively, demonstrated German helplessness. The Luftwaffe that had once dominated European skies was now unable to prevent American aircraft from reaching any target in Germany. Adolf Goland later reflected, "The Mustang was the best fighter of the war. Not because it was the fastest. It wasn't. Not because it was the most maneuverable, the Zero and Spitfire could outturn it, but because it could do everything well enough while flying farther than any other fighter. That combination of range, speed, armament, and reliability made it unbeatable." When Mustangs appeared over Berlin, we knew we'd lost control of German airspace permanently. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the P-51 Mustang had fundamentally changed aerial warfare. The concept that bombers needed short-range escorts that would turn back, leaving bombers vulnerable over targets, was proven obsolete. Long-range escorts could protect bomber formations throughout entire missions, making strategic bombing campaigns sustainable and effective. The American pilots who flew P-51s to Berlin and beyond in 1944, 1945 broke the back of German air defense. Not through superior individual aircraft performance, German fighters remained competitive in many respects, but through range that German fighters couldn't match and escort protection that German defenders couldn't overcome. March 4, 1944. The day German pilots first saw P-51 Mustangs over Berlin. was the day German air defense strategy collapsed. The fighters that weren't supposed to have the range to reach Berlin were circling at 25,000 IFT protecting bombers that would destroy German industry. German pilots who'd calculated that Berlin was safe from escorted raids watched those calculations become irrelevant. The P-51 hadn't just extended fighter range, it had eliminated the concept of safe distance. If American bombers could reach a target, P-51 escorts could reach it too. And once P-51s arrived over Berlin, German pilots knew that nowhere in Germany was beyond American reach. That realization that air superiority was lost, that German airspace couldn't be defended, that the war was being lost from the air, began on March 4, 1944, the day the impossible became reality. The day P-51 Mustangs flew over Berlin.